Ojo con los cables. Sí, va. Se viene todo eso.
In a matter of weeks, Jerusalem shifted. Rivers surge past their limits without warning. Solid ground caves in, swallowing as if they were never there. And beneath it all, dark residue surfaced from ancient layers, long buried. Individually, each event could be explained, but they did not occur in isolation. They unfolded together, compressed in time, layered in meaning, accelerating. History rarely announces turning points in advance. Before we decide what any of this means, do you believe these are just natural events? Or could this be the kind of warning Jesus told us to watch for? Stay with us as we are going to look carefully at what is actually happening. Please click the like and subscribe button to support us. Thank you so much. Let's look carefully at what is actually happening. In early spring, the city expected renewal. The rains had been steady through the colder months. The cisterns were full. The terraces along the hillsides showed the first signs of green. Yet what came was not a single violent storm, but a slow tightening, an unseen pressure gathering across the valleys and wadis surrounding the ancient city. Cool air lingered longer than it should have, pressing down from the higher elevations toward the Kidron Valley. At the same time, late seasonal rains fell upon ground already saturated. The limestone soil, layered and compacted by centuries, could take no more. Along the slopes east of the city, runnels of brown water traced their way through olive groves, cutting across footpaths that had been dry only days before. Low boundary walls built from stacked stone weakened and collapsed in sections. Life adjusted, as it always had. Children remained indoors, while elders checked the integrity of cistern covers. Neighbors worked side by side, clearing debris from channels with wooden tools, reinforcing earthen banks with stones carried by hand. Only after the danger became undeniable did deeper questions surface. When spring, a season meant for planting and steady growth, brings rising waters instead, survival comes first, meaning follows later. Yet in Scripture, when water crosses its boundaries, it is rarely described as meaningless. In the writings attributed to Isaiah, the earth is said to stagger when its order is shaken, not merely as a physical event, but as a sign that deeper foundations are being tested. What unsettled many was not only the overflow, but how quickly it became routine. Stones were rearranged, new paths were memorized, barriers were built higher. What had first felt like disruption slowly blended into daily life. Jesus described his return not with constant visible upheaval, but with an atmosphere of normal life continuing uninterrupted. In the Gospel of Matthew 24:37-39, he compared that day to the time before the flood, people eating, planting, building, unaware that history was approaching a turning point. The emphasis was not chaos, but complacency. Not destruction alone, but surprise. The return of Christ, according to his own words, will arrive in a world still functioning, fields tended, homes occupied, routines intact. The dividing line will not be drawn by who noticed the rain, but by who understood what it meant. As the waters of the valley press against their banks, and the streets of Jerusalem mirror the sky above, one question lingers beneath the surface. Will the people pause to discern what this crossing of boundaries reveals, or will they simply adapt, stone by stone, and learn to live with it, overlooking the warning written plainly across the land? It was still within that calm that something unexpected emerged. High along the ridge of the Mount of Olives, the earth began to open. Not with a roar, not with an explosion, but with a subtle tearing sound, stone shifting against stone. A narrow fracture appeared across the surface of the hillside, thin at first, almost easy to overlook. Then it lengthened. It crept forward through the soil, splitting ancient pathways and cutting across terraces that had stood undisturbed for centuries. What unsettled observers was not only the crack itself, but its direction. The fracture did not spread randomly. It traced a visible line westward, descending the slope as though drawn with intention. Smaller fissures branched from it, but the main tier held a steady course, angled toward the sealed eastern entrance of the old city, the Golden Gate. From above, the pattern resembled a pathway carved by unseen hands, guiding the eye from the summit of the mount directly toward the ancient stones of the gate. People gathered at a distance, standing silently along the ridge. Just hours earlier, the same ground had supported pilgrims, shepherds, and travelers. Now the soil lay split open, revealing layers of rock beneath jagged, uneven, unstable. Pebbles and fragments slid downward into the widening seam. The disturbance did not level buildings or swallow entire streets. It did something quieter, yet deeply unsettling. It altered what had always been trusted as fixed. The Mount of Olives has long stood as a witness to history, overlooking the Temple Mount, the valleys, the gates. To see its surface divided and seemingly aligned toward the Golden Gate stirred questions that went beyond geology. Scholars quickly pointed to natural explanations. Seasonal rains can loosen limestone formations. Subsurface erosion can create tension within rock layers. Minor tectonic adjustments, even when unfelt, can produce visible fractures. From a scientific standpoint, these possibilities are reasonable. Yet for many who know the Hebrew scriptures, the imagery felt striking. The prophet Zechariah wrote of a day when the Mount of Olives would be split, forming a valley from east to west. Zechariah 14:4. The text speaks not of chaos for its own sake, but of a moment when the Lord stands upon the mount and the landscape itself responds. Whether read symbolically or literally, the passage has shaped expectation for centuries. To witness even a small fracture upon that same ridge, stretching in the direction of the eastern gate, naturally draws the mind back to those words. This does not demand panic. It invites reflection. Is this merely a geological event in a city built upon fault lines, or is it a reminder that even the most ancient ground can shift when deeper purposes are at work? As the ground began to shift in Jerusalem in early spring, attention turned quickly toward the heart of the city. What had been discussed in quiet meetings and private gatherings was now moving into public view. Preparations connected to the long-anticipated construction of a third temple were no longer theoretical. Survey teams were seen taking measurements. Stone samples were examined. Certain priestly garments and ritual vessels, long preserved in expectation, were quietly displayed again for instruction and review. The atmosphere in the city was not chaotic, but it was charged. Plans that had circulated for years were now being spoken of with urgency. Groups devoted to temple restoration increased their activity. Training in ancient rites resumed with renewed seriousness. Discussions about altar placement, foundational alignment, and ritual purity were no longer distant concepts, but active considerations. What had once seemed symbolic began to feel procedural. At the same time, tension intensified. Security around sensitive areas tightened. Political leaders urged caution. Religious authorities debated timelines and legitimacy. Each announcement carried weight far beyond the city itself. Jerusalem has never been merely local. Every development within its walls echoes outward. What concerned many observers was not a single action, but the acceleration. Conversations that once stretched across decades now seemed compressed into months. Amid these developments, one image stood out. Small groups gathered in prayer near the eastern side of the city, not as organized demonstrations, but as quiet appeals. No banners, no amplified speeches. Just individuals facing the direction where the ancient sanctuary once stood, asking for wisdom, protection, and clarity. Their posture reflected something deeper than political aspiration. It reflected awareness that human plans, especially in Jerusalem, cannot move forward without consequence. This moment is testing more than engineering capability or administrative resolve. It is testing spiritual discernment. When foundations are discussed in a city where foundations carry prophetic meaning, the question becomes larger than construction. It touches covenant, history, and expectation. The Hebrew scriptures repeatedly tie Jerusalem's sanctuary to obedience and reverence. In Haggai, the people are urged to consider your ways before rebuilding the house of the Lord. Haggai 1-5-7. The emphasis is not merely on structure, but on alignment of heart and purpose. Building without reflection is portrayed as hollow. Construction without humility invites instability. As preparations quietly advance and debates grow more intense, a deeper question lingers over the city. Is this simply the unfolding of historical ambition, or a moment requiring spiritual examination? Jerusalem has seen temples rise and fall before. Each time, the visible stones reflected invisible realities. In early spring, as activity increases and attention sharpens, the issue is no longer whether something can be built. The greater question is whether those involved are prepared not only with materials and plans, but with reverence, wisdom, and awareness of the weight carried by every stone laid in this city. As attention in Jerusalem centered increasingly on sacred ground and renewed religious discussions, another development began to draw quiet concern. It did not involve structural collapse or visible fracture. It involved something surfacing, something long buried beneath layers of earth and time. Near the southern approaches to the city, in areas not far from the ancient valleys that bordered Jerusalem, dark residue began appearing along exposed soil and stone. It was thick, almost tar-like in texture. Not mud, not runoff from rainfall. It clung to rock surfaces and pooled in shallow depressions. There were no nearby industrial sites to explain it, no transport accidents, no modern source that could account for the material. At first, it was dismissed as isolated seepage, small patches, easily overlooked. But reports increased. The substance was not emerging from a single crack or channel. It appeared in separate points, scattered across different elevations, as if rising upward from beneath rather than flowing downward from above. Researchers who examined samples suggested that what was surfacing was not recent contamination. The composition pointed to ancient organic deposits, material compressed and sealed beneath sediment layers for centuries. This was not creation. It was exposure. Jerusalem has witnessed similar moments before. Historical records describe episodes where hidden chambers were uncovered during construction near the city of David. Ancient scrolls were discovered in caves near the Dead Sea after centuries of silence. What unsettled observers was not merely the material itself, but the convergence of timing, discussions about sacred rebuilding, renewed focus on temple service, heightened excavation in and around historically sensitive zones, and now, beneath it all, the land releasing something old. The Hebrew scriptures often frame such moments as revelations rather than accidents. In Ecclesiastes it is written, "There is nothing hidden that will not be disclosed, and nothing concealed that will not be brought to light." Ecclesiastes 12:14. Jerusalem is a city civilizations have built, destroyed, buried, and rebuilt upon the same ground. Each generation leaves something beneath the next. When ancient matter surfaces unexpectedly, it forces a question deeper than geology. What else lies beneath historically, spiritually, covenantally, that has yet to be brought into the open? As attention in Jerusalem continued to focus on sacred preparations and shifting ground, another development unfolded quietly on the eastern side of the city. Along the slopes, descending toward the wilderness beyond the Dead Sea Road, unusual earthen formations began to draw notice. They were not sinkholes. They were not fractures. Instead, several tall mounds of compacted soil had risen into narrow columns, upright, hardened, and strikingly shaped. Their surfaces appeared crusted and pale, as if baked by years of mineral seepage and compression. At first, they were dismissed as natural erosion. Wind and water have sculpted the hills around Jerusalem for centuries. Yet what unsettled observers was not merely their height, but their posture. These columns did not lean randomly. They stood rigid, elongated, almost human in outline. From certain angles, the silhouettes resembled figures frozen mid-step. Even more striking was their orientation. The majority of the formations faced west toward the city itself, toward Jerusalem. Locals who passed by began to speak quietly of the resemblance to the ancient account of Lot's wife, turned into a pillar after looking back toward Sodom. The comparison was not precise, yet it was difficult to ignore. The shapes were not broad hills or scattered ridges. They were singular, vertical, and solitary, and they faced the city as though fixed in permanent gaze. Geologists offered practical explanations. Layers of sediment mixed with mineral-rich groundwater can harden unevenly over time. When surrounding soil erodes, denser cores may remain standing as natural pillars. Pressure, evaporation, and long-term environmental exposure can produce rigid columns from what was once loose earth. Such phenomena have been recorded in desert regions before. Yet Jerusalem is not merely a geological site. It is a city saturated with narrative memory. When forms in the land echo ancient imagery, interpretation inevitably follows. Historically, similar moments have shaped reflection in this region. The rediscovery of long-buried altars altered national direction. The uncovering of forgotten scrolls redefined covenantal awareness. Even natural events have repeatedly been read not only as physical occurrences, but as mirrors, forcing the people to examine posture, direction, and allegiance. The meaning, then, does not rest in whether the columns are miraculous. It rests in what they symbolize. In the Genesis account, Lot's wife is not judged for movement alone, but for orientation, for looking back toward what she was commanded to leave behind. The pillar becomes a symbol of divided loyalty, of hesitation between past and future, a fixed reminder that direction matters. Now, in early spring, as Jerusalem wrestles with questions of identity, heritage, and sacred rebuilding, upright earthen forms stand east of the city, facing its walls. Whether shaped purely by erosion or by deeper forces of time, their presence carries metaphorical weight. They appear as witnesses, silent, unmoving, directed toward the place where covenant history converges. The deeper question is not how wind and minerals formed them. It is what their orientation suggests, in a season when Jerusalem itself stands at a crossroads of intention. Are these pillars merely remnants of erosion, or do they serve as a visual parable reminding a city shaped by obedience and exile that posture toward its calling matters more than appearance? The land around Jerusalem has always spoken through stone. This time, it speaks through figures of earth upright, still, and facing the city, as if asking a single, quiet question. Which direction will you choose? Why did Jesus say, "Remember Lot's wife"? Lot's wife is remembered for looking back at the cities while they were being destroyed when God commanded them not to do so. Some wonder how we know she turned into a pillar of salt, and that can be explained by the simple idea that someone was behind her when she turned. In regards to what Jesus stated in Luke 17, he is recorded as telling the disciples about the end times and how disastrous they are going to be, even much worse than Sodom and Gomorrah. This is when he mentions Lot's wife in verse 32. It means that when Jerusalem was being destroyed by the Romans, the people who are fleeing were not supposed to stop to get personal effects or get friends or family. They would have to have regard only for their lives to flee the destruction. It also has a meaning for Christians today, in that we cannot live with both feet, so to speak, in this world. Although we live here, our hearts ought to be with the Lord, and our future home with Him. We are here to do the Lord's work, but we are not supposed to put all our hopes and desires into the things of the world other than family. Our focus needs to be on Christ. Jesus interpreted Mosaic law out of Deuteronomy, when asked by the Pharisees to weigh in on a running dispute as to justification. Moses had told the Israelites what to do if a man found some uncleanness in his wife. He had to write her a bill of divorcement. The debate was serious. If the uncleanness was adultery, divorce would not be necessary. The woman could have been stoned to death. If the uncleanness was less than adultery, then what qualified for grounds? Some men would be happy to make some excuse to dump the old lady, and then be free to marry someone else. Others, a little more righteous, felt that it should not be so easy. But where to draw the line? It should be said that Jesus was not legislating new divorce policy in this passage. He was expounding on Old Testament law, and explaining it in light of the fully revealed will of God. God had already told Israel, "I hate divorce." So why a provision for it? Jesus explained that it was not God's ideal plan for marriage that such situations would exist, but in accommodation for the hardness of their hearts, the mechanism was created. The woman would not be thrown out to merely fend for herself. The bill of divorcement was understood by many to provide some arrangement for the woman's future. But Jesus stated that these frivolous divorces that take advantage of what amounted to a humanitarian provision for the worst of cases really were so unrighteous as to not be recognized in the eyes of God, and the man who divorced his wife for the actual purpose of hooking up with someone else was trying to legitimize adultery, and they would be judged for that. The only exception Jesus noted was sexual impurity. This being the case, it settles a side issue at the same time. Just because adultery could be punished by stoning to death, it did not necessarily have to be so. In fact, this was the case of the prophet Hosea, whose wife Gomer apparently got around a fair bit. God instructed Hosea to put up with her for the time being, as she was a perfect example of unfaithful Israel in their relationship with God. Hosea was to take her back when she came to the end of her run, as God was patiently waiting to do the same for his own wayward people. But Jesus did not enact a new law that was harder to keep than even the old one was. He merely demonstrated the meaning of the passage in terms of the Old Covenant. His teaching is an encouragement for married people to work out their differences rather than opt for the easy way out. But one condition that existed in Moses' day is still with us today. People are just as hard-hearted as ever. So it should be stated, on the record, that while divorce is certainly a failure, and not generally as things should be, we sometimes find ourselves in situations where there really is no choice. God loves and forgives. Divorce is not the unforgivable sin, and remarriage can often solve many problems and give people a second chance. To stand in the way of that on religious grounds is harmful to the divorced party, as well as any children that may be involved. The financial situation can be very oppressive, and a remarriage can cure that. I personally don't believe that God expects people to live in poverty and squalor with their children begging for crumbs, when a new, healthy nuclear family can be formed from the ashes of a broken marriage. It is out of character, cruel, and harsh. God loves and forgives. I think we should join him in that. Remember Lot's wife, said Jesus. That is probably the most dramatic, potent illustration the Master ever used in a sermon. As we read the context, it is very obvious that the words were being applied to those living on this planet right now. In that day refers to the day when the Son of Man is revealed. Here is what Jesus actually said. Likewise also, as it was in the days of Lot, they did eat, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they builded. But the same day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven, and destroyed them all. Even thus shall it be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed. In that day he which shall be upon the housetop, and his stuff in the house, let him not come down to take it away, and he that is in the field, let him likewise not return back. Remember Lot's wife. Luke 17:28, 3:2. What did Jesus mean by that cryptic expression, remember Lot's wife? What does that woman of long ago have to do with people who are watching the closeout of history? Why did the Master relate Mrs. Lot to our day? Jesus used her as a fearful warning. That woman became cold, careless, and disobedient. Finally, the judgments of God fell upon her, and she became a pillar of salt on the plains of Sodom. Lot's good intentions. But let's come back to the story of Lot's wife and try to understand what Jesus wants us to learn from her example. According to the Bible record, She belonged to one of the finest families in the East. As the nephew of Abraham, Lot shared the tremendous faith of his uncle and prayed at Abraham's altar. When God's call came to get out of Mesopotamia, Lot went right along with Abraham, not knowing where the call might lead. Together they brought their families to the entering place of the Promised Land and offered their sacrifices of thanksgiving. Then dissension erupted between the herdsmen of the two wealthy kinsmen. Their vast combined flocks and herds didn't have enough room to graze in such a restricted area, and they had to separate. Lot was given the choice of direction as the whole land stretched out before him. On one side lay the verdant hills with their lofty trees. The other led down into the crowded centers of commerce and trade. The materialistic appeal of the prosperous cities had an immediate impact on Lot, and the Bible records very simply that he pitched his tent toward Sodom, Genesis 13:12. The predictable pattern of future tragedy was settled by that early decision to move near those wicked cities. Lot stands forth as a man of good intentions. Quite obviously, he did not actually plan to take his family into the urban environment of sinful Sodom. He would only live in the vicinity, where he could take advantage of the economic opportunities of such a bustling trade capital. Very likely he made special mental reservations about letting his family mingle with the degraded inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah. In fact, he had no idea at all of giving up his religion. His move was prompted by selfish concern over temporal advantages, and he had no intention of losing anything. But what happened in spite of all the wonderful intentions? Poor Lot lost his wife, his possessions, and almost his own life. Good intentions were not good enough. He moved closer and closer to the cities, until finally he actually moved in to dwell with the Sodomites. His plans to guard the spiritual interests of his children failed to materialize. All his rationalization about counteracting the wickedness with stricter prayer schedules and family altar religion just didn't seem to work out as planned. He gradually compromised with the environment and watched his children slowly assimilate the ways of their heathen neighbors. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and keep an eye out for our next video. Leave a comment and let us know what you think.
هذا رسول الله حبيب الله أشرف خلق الله أعظم العالمين.
بحر الكويت الآن. يا سبحان الله.
نتيجة الحفريات بنشوف التشققات في أماكن مختلفة وأثرها الكبير على متانة المباني وعلى
Something unusual has begun unfolding in Jerusalem quietly, layer by layer. Within a short span of time, observers reported a moving beam of light above the Temple Mount, shifting quietly as prayers rose below. Days later, the ground along the Mount of Olives revealed a narrow fracture, followed by a brief vibration of ancient stones near the sealed Golden Gate, detected without any recorded earthquake. Then, in the silence of the night, a deep trumpet-like sound echoed from beneath the streets of the old city. Individually, each event can be explained. But together, they form a pattern touching the sky, the ground, the structures, and the hidden spaces below, raising a single question: are these isolated disturbances, or the early stages of a message unfolding? Before we dive into details, please consider liking this video and pressing the subscribe button. Every contribution does great things. Thank you very much. Imagine this. Just after evening prayers, a narrow beam of light formed high above the Temple Mount. At first, many assumed it was a military aircraft passing overhead, or simply a reflection of powerful spotlights from nearby tourist areas shining into the night sky. But within minutes, observers noticed something unusual. The light did not remain still. It moved. What drew the most attention was the way it moved. Each time groups gathered in prayer, the beam seemed to shift slowly, gliding from one section of the mount to another, pausing as voices rose, then continuing again when the prayers quieted. People watching from nearby rooftops and streets recorded the same pattern. When prayer lines formed, the light hovered. When they dispersed, it drifted forward again. It did not flash randomly or scatter across the clouds. It held its shape thin, bright, and steady, moving with a rhythm that felt connected to the moments unfolding below. For a city where every sighting carries memory, the sight stirred deep reflection. Ancient scripture speaks of light not only as illumination, but as a sign of divine attention, a signal that something is about to unfold, rather than something that has already arrived. Throughout the Old Testament, moments of turning, repentance, or collective prayer were often marked not by chaos, but by quiet signs led by light. In Isaiah 60:1, it is written, "Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord rises upon you." The verse does not describe destruction or chaos. It describes the start of illumination, the moment when attention is first drawn upward before the next events begin to appear. And that, the sky, was only the beginning. Within days, attention quietly shifted from what appeared above the city to what began to appear along its eastern ridge, where the ground itself seemed to reveal the next sign. After the recent disturbances, Jerusalem did not fully return to its usual quiet. Attention slowly shifted eastward, toward the slopes of the Mount of Olives, an area watched closely for both historical and geological reasons. There, survey teams and local observers reported the appearance of a narrow ground fracture that had not been visible before. At first glance, it looked small, almost easy to dismiss, but its location quickly drew interest. The crack did not form near the large Jewish burial areas that cover much of the mountain. Instead, it appeared at a distance from the main tomb sections, emerging along a stretch of land close to the ancient pathway, long associated with the route Jesus once walked when entering Jerusalem. This detail immediately caught public attention, not because of its size, but because of where it appeared away from heavily eroded burial slopes, yet near one of the most historically remembered routes in the region. Geologists who examined the site offered cautious explanations. According to several field specialists, such fractures can occur when shallow limestone layers gradually shift after seasonal moisture changes or minor underground pressure adjustments. However, what they noted as unusual was the direction of the fracture. For many residents, the discovery stirred reflection because the Mount of Olives has long held symbolic meaning tied to moments of transition and expectation. The Old Testament contains a striking passage connected directly to this very mountain. In Zechariah 14:4, it is written, "On that day his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives, and the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west." The verse describes a dramatic future event, far greater than any small surface fracture. And the ground did not remain the final layer to respond. Each of these events can be explained or dismissed. But when signs begin appearing across different layers of the same city above it, within it, and beneath it, the conversation changes. What once seemed isolated begins to form alignment. Now a different layer had shifted within the same period of time, not violently, but noticeably enough to interrupt routine. Not far from this eastern ridge, along the sealed entrance known as the Golden Gate, another quiet development soon drew attention from the stones themselves. While unusual signs in the sky and ground captured public attention, something far quieter was reported at ground level near the Golden Gate, one of the most historic entrances to Jerusalem's eastern wall. Visitors and maintenance staff described a brief but noticeable sensation. Several ancient stone slabs surrounding the sealed gate seemed to vibrate very lightly for a few seconds, then return to stillness. What made the event unusual was the absence of any seismic confirmation. Regional monitoring stations detected no P waves or S waves, the primary signals normally recorded during even the smallest earthquakes. Traffic logs showed no heavy vehicles passing nearby at the time, and no construction or drilling activity was underway within the surrounding district. The motion was extremely localized, brief, and limited to a small cluster of ancient paving stones directly adjacent to the gate. Geologists who reviewed the reports offered several cautious possibilities. Some suggested that shallow microstress adjustments within the limestone foundation could occasionally release very small pulses of energy, too weak to register on distant seismic equipment, but still strong enough to produce a short surface vibration in a confined area. What stood out to researchers was not the strength of the motion, but its narrow range and the lack of any continuing after effects. For many observers, however, the symbolic setting gave the incident a deeper emotional weight. The Golden Gate has remained sealed for centuries, surrounded by stones that have witnessed empires rise and fall. In the Old Testament, Habakkuk 2:11 contains a striking image. The stone will cry out from the wall, and the beam from the woodwork will answer it. The passage speaks poetically of silent structures becoming witnesses when human voices fail to speak truth. Seen purely through science, the brief vibration can be explained as a small, localized, geological adjustment, yet the setting invites reflection. Stones, usually seen as lifeless and unmoving, briefly became the center of attention not through noise, but through motion. And in a place where history, faith, and memory are built almost entirely from stone, even the faintest movement can feel like a reminder that the ground beneath the city is never completely silent. The way into the people of God is through understanding the story of God's dealings with His people all through the history of Scripture, and becoming a part of that story through Israel's Messiah, Jesus. Soon afterward, residents within the old city began reporting something that could not be seen at all, only heard echoing through the night like a distant horn rising from beneath the streets. Among the many unusual reports connected to Jerusalem, one of the most discussed in recent nights has not come from light or fire, but from sound. Residents and visitors inside the old city have described hearing a deep, low tone echoing through the streets long after midnight, a sound many compared to a distant trumpet blowing from somewhere beneath the ground. The tone did not resemble traffic noise, machinery, or aircraft. Witnesses described it as steady, hollow, and heavy, as if air were moving through a vast underground chamber. It lasted only a short time each night, sometimes less than a minute, yet strong enough to be heard across several nearby quarters before fading into silence. Several individuals offered similar accounts. A night security guard stationed near one of the stone gates said the sound seemed to rise from below the pavement rather than from the sky. A shop owner living above his closed store reported waking suddenly to what he first believed was a ceremonial horn, only to realize that no procession or event was taking place. A visiting traveler staying in a small guest house near the Armenian Quarter described the vibration accompanying the sound as soft but real, saying the window frame trembled slightly while the tone passed. Despite these consistent testimonies, local monitoring stations recorded no seismic disturbance, and no scheduled construction or underground blasting was reported during the same hours. Geologists reviewing the reports suggested that certain underground cavities beneath the old city, many of them ancient tunnels, cisterns, and carved chambers, can occasionally channel moving air or distant vibrations in ways that amplify low-frequency sounds. When pressure differences build between connected underground spaces, air can rush through narrow openings, producing tones that resemble deep horns or distant trumpets. Such acoustic effects are rare but possible in areas with layered stone and extensive hidden passages. Still, researchers acknowledged that determining the exact source would require detailed underground acoustic mapping that has not yet been conducted in the historic district. For many observers, the symbolism of the sound has drawn attention as much as the sound itself. In the Old Testament, the trumpet often marked moments of gathering, warning, or transition. Joel 2:1 declares, "Blow the trumpet in Zion, sound an alarm on my holy mountain." In ancient times, the trumpet was not merely music. It was a signal that something significant was happening, calling people to awareness, to assembly, or to preparation. Whether the nighttime tone has a natural acoustic explanation or remains temporarily unexplained, the consistency of the reports has left many residents quietly watchful. In a city built above layers of ancient stone, tunnels, and chambers that have carried echoes for thousands of years, even a brief sound rising from the depths can feel powerful. Not loud, not destructive, just a deep note in the darkness, reminding those who hear it how thin the line can be between silence and signal. What is the significance of Jerusalem in religion? Jerusalem is not an ordinary landscape. It is a place where history is compressed into short distances, where sites separated by only a few streets carry meaning shaped over thousands of years. Because of this, timing and placement often matter as much as the events themselves. When unusual developments occur along the same eastern corridor of the city, near the Temple Mount, the ancient gates, and the slopes that overlook them, they naturally draw deeper attention than similar events occurring elsewhere. The significance of Jerusalem in the Abrahamic tradition is that it was King David's capital city, and it was the location where King Solomon built the first temple, at least according to the books of Samuel and Kings in the Bible. The story in the Bible continues after that point, and 400 years later the first temple and the city of Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians. This event is corroborated by extra-biblical and archaeological records. Many of the Judahites were sent into exile in Babylon at that point, and the Bible claims this to be the will of God. The biblical narrative and historical record does not end there, though. The Babylonians are conquered by the Persians under King Cyrus, and many of the Judahites returned from exile and constructed a second temple in Jerusalem. This temple stood for another 400 to 500 years, until was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE. This is why Jerusalem is important in Judaism, and it's from this tradition that Jerusalem also gains its importance in Christianity and Islam. In Christianity, Jerusalem is the site of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ. In Islam, Jerusalem is the place where Muhammad ascended to heaven. And significantly, at the location of the temple now sits the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, regarded as the third holiest location in all of Islam. What is striking is not the size of the disturbances, but their sequence. None of them have been catastrophic. None have reshaped the skyline or forced evacuations. Instead, they have appeared quietly, almost carefully, one after another, touching different parts of the same historic zone. First, attention was drawn upward. Then the ground revealed tension. And as observers continued watching, the question slowly began to change from, "What is this event?" to, "Why are several different layers of the city responding at the same time?" Patterns rarely announce themselves loudly at the beginning. They assemble gradually, piece by piece, until the repetition becomes difficult to ignore. And when multiple signals, light, stone, and shifting ground emerge within the same narrow window of time, even cautious observers begin to wonder whether the city is experiencing isolated incidents or the early stages of something forming beneath the surface that has not yet fully revealed itself. Since Jerusalem plays such a major role in Jewish tradition and in the Jewish imagination as a symbol, it's hard to generalize, but I would say its significance is primarily religious. To understand the religious significance, one has to have some familiarity with basic Jewish religious concepts. Judaism holds that God is everywhere, that he has no body or material aspect, and yet he has chosen a place for his presence to dwell. Dwell, in quotes, and that place is Jerusalem. Yet how can we understand dwell as applied to a God that is everywhere? It's a paradox to think that a God who is everywhere can dwell somewhere, so we need explanations. Perhaps that dwelling is merely a concentration where his presence becomes manifest and can be felt more intensely, or dwelling can be understood as the designation of a spot, an address, so to speak, to serve as a focal point for worship. It cannot be taken literally, and yet it is. God dwells in Jerusalem. This is combined with a commandment to build him a house there, the Jerusalem temple. Here, the idea of concentration becomes clearer. We learn from the prophet Isaiah that the whole earth is full of God's glory, is 6-3. Even so, Israel is the holy land, Jerusalem is the holy city, Mount Zion is the holy mountain, the temple is the holy sanctuary, and a small room inside the temple, the Holy of Holies, is the most sacred spot on earth, for God's presence dwells there. Many additional components add to the religious significance of Jerusalem, such as the belief that the temple is built on the same spot where Abraham sacrificed a ram in place of his son Isaac, that Jacob wrestled with an angel there and saw a ladder ascending to heaven from Jerusalem, and most importantly, that out of Zion shall go forth the Torah, as the prophet Micah foretold. Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, so that we may walk in his paths. The Torah will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Micah 4-2. Taken together, the religious significance of Jerusalem in Judaism is unparalleled and unalterable. What would happen if we interpreted everything in the vision as a description not of their place, but of the people themselves? And what then happens if we use that as a way of imagining the destiny of the people of God in the current day? The reason for asking these questions comes from some writing I have been doing in the last couple of months. I was asked to write a short study booklet of around 15,000 words on Revelation for small groups meeting for 6 sessions. And for the final session, I was once more reading Rev 21 and was struck forcibly by the opening claim John makes at the start of this vision. I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. Rev 21.2. There is no doubt that the use of bride is a personal metaphor for the people of God. It has been used earlier in Revelation to signify the people of God, the saints or holy ones, as they experience oppression in the 42 months of their wilderness wanderings between the exaltation of Jesus and his return. The Gentiles will trample it. 11-2. And previous use of the personal metaphor of the people of God as the bride in 19-7-8 identifies the adornment of her fine clothing as the righteous acts of God's people, which connects this vision to the earlier, less developed nuptial imagery of 14-4-5. The personal adornment and the jewels of the city are neatly connected by the background text Isa 61-10, where the bride adorns herself with jewels. But there is another reason why we might press the city imagery to be that of a people rather than a place. John also emphasizes that the city is the dwelling place of God, Rev 21.3, and the fact that the city is a cube, thus looking like an enormous Holy of Holies in the temple, confirms this. But with the anticipated, recalled, destruction of the physical temple in Jerusalem in AD 70, the NT consistently transfers temple language to the new covenant Israel of God, that is, the Jewish Gentile followers of Jesus. Thus, Jesus declares his own body to be the new temple presence of God in the world in John 2:1-9a, claim picked up at his trial in Mark 14.58. Paul develops his metaphor of the followers of Jesus as his body from his Damascus Road encounter. Why are you persecuting me? So that both the community and individuals within it are God's temple and his dwelling place. 1 Cor 3.16-17, 1 Cor 6.19. In fact, Paul goes so far as to actually draw on the exact OT image that John makes use of in Rev 21. What agreement is there between the temple of God and idols? For we are the temple of the living God. As God has said, I will live with them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. 2 Cor 6.15. Paul is here making an ethical appeal to the Corinthians on the basis of the spiritual understanding of the ecclesia as the holy dwelling place of God. But what is fascinating here is that he is drawing on a range of OT texts. Firstly, he is drawing from Lev 26.12, which is the promise looking forward to the settlement of the people in the Promised Land. But then he is also drawing on Jer 32.38 and Ezek 37.27, which are both repurposing this future promise to look forward to the end of exile and the restoration of God's kingly rule over his people when they are restored to that land. And here's the thing, this is the move that Revelation is constantly making, combining promises of the Exodus with promises of the end of exile. This is found most clearly in the use of the equivalent time periods 3.5 years, 42 months, and 1,260 days that we find in chapters 11 and 12. The number 42 corresponds to the desert wanderings, since the total time in the desert is 42 years if you include the sojourn at Kadesh Barnea, and the people stop at 42 places listed in Num 33. But John's calculation using perfect months of 30 days each makes this equivalent to the time of tribulation in Daniel 7.25 and 12.7. For John, the followers of Jesus are both in a time of Exodus wanderings, heading towards the Promised Land, and in a time of tribulation, as they await final deliverance, which is first enacted by Jesus' death and resurrection, but only completed with the descent of the Holy City. And for Paul, these promises are clearly fulfilled in Jesus. The question then arises, can we read the vision of the Holy City completely in those personal terms, as people rather than place? There are good reasons in the text for moving from city as people to city as place. Stephen Pattimore, in his monograph, The People of God in the Apocalypse, SNTS, monograph, Series 128, 2004, notes some of the reasons, principally the nature of the metaphorical language, particularly in the second half of the vision. So what does happen when we press this to be a personal vision of the people of God rather than a place? The city is on a great, high mountain, Rev 21.1. The people of God are visible, like a city on a hill, Matt 5.14, and they draw all sorts of people to them. It shone with the glory of God, and its brilliance was like that of a very precious jewel, like a jasper, clear as crystal, Rev 21.11. The attractiveness of the people is due only to the presence and glory of God in their midst, and it is this which draws people, rather than any particular quality of its own. Jasper has characterized the appearance of the One on the throne in the opening vision of heavenly worship in Revenued 4.3. So the people of God look stunning and impressive to the extent to which their passes owe. Character reflects the character of God, and they are to have a transparency about them. The idea of being clear as crystal suggests that there is no pretense. The city has great high walls, Rev 21.1-2. If we read this as about people not place, then rather than being contained in a place of safety, the people themselves are a place of safety. But angels guard the gates, and nothing impure will ever enter it, Rev 21.27. There is always an open welcome. But this is received by repentance, forgiveness, and cleansing that comes through the death of Jesus for us. There were 3 gates on the east, 3 on the north, 3 on the south, and 3 on the west, Rev 21.13. Where ancient cities had gates usually only on one side, this city can be accessed from every direction. There is no limit to the different ways in which people can join to become part of the people of God. The wall was made of jasper, and the city of pure gold, as pure as glass, Rev 21.18. The mention of jasper again symbolizes the character of God, but the image of gold consistently represents faith, sometimes in the context of being purified through testing, often by persecution. See 1 Cor 3.12, 1 Peter 1.7, and especially Rev 3.18. Gold as pure as glass might then symbolize a people with pure faith and absolute trust in God, perfectly refined by having come through the most severe of tests. The 12 gates were 12 pearls, each gate made of a single pearl, Rev 21. 22. Within the text, these pearls are a counterpoint to the pearls worn by the harlot Babylon. Revernated 17.4. And within John's context, this refers to the ostentatious delight taken by the extremely wealthy in pearls, which were valued more highly than diamonds. The nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their splendor into it. Rev 21.24. As I mentioned above, this resonates with Jesus' teaching to his followers that, "You are the light of the world." Matt 5.14. But John goes further. Not only does the wise and illuminating presence of God amongst and in his people shed light on the whole world, his people are even hospitable to the best that the wider world has to offer, the splendor of the kings of the earth. Taken as a whole, the nations seem to be constantly opposed to God and his people. They trample the holy city 11-2. They are angry with God 11:18. They were seduced by the great prostitute 14-8. 18-3, and deceived by the magical spells of her prosperity 18:23. They are deceived by Satan and make war with the Lamb in the final battle 19:15. 20-8. And yet, from the beginning, Jesus is the rightful Lord over them 1-5, 12-5, and shares his authority with his followers 2:26, and God is King of the nations 15-3. Finally, if we read the imagery personally rather than architecturally, then the water of life signifying the gift of the Spirit flows not so much through a city as through God's people, and the fruit of the tree of life grows in them, and it is their foliage that provides healing. But what difference might it make to us now, in practice? Some readers of Rev 21 want to take it in quite a realized way as a description of the present reality of the church, or at least what the church might be in the present. I think Simon Woodman, in his SCM core text, reads it in this way. I don't find that persuasive, due to the strongly future perspective that these chapters have, in contrast to the earlier parts of the book. But it does offer us a picture of what we are heading to, so that, even if this will never be fully realized in this age, we at least begin to see signs of this, and it might shape our ambitions for what we are in the process of becoming. What it might mean is that God is seeking to form us into a people in his likeness, who are transparent in our integrity and have nothing to hide. We become a safe place for others to find refuge. We constantly are open to welcome people in, of every kind, coming from every direction, but at the same time, there is nothing evil or unclean to be found in our midst. Since the Spirit of God is forming us in holiness and purity, we are shaped by both the story of Israel, which has become our story, and the apostolic testimony to the life and truth of Jesus. Our faith, that is, our complete trust in God, has been purified to perfection by faithfulness in the face of trials and difficulties, so that our trust in God is without flaw. As a community, we are marked by the wisdom of the ages, and we offer a place of hospitality to all that is best in the world around us. People of all faiths, and none look to us for wisdom, integrity, and insight. In one sense, there is nothing new here. All these remarkable ambitions can be found elsewhere in the Scriptures. But John's direct and striking imagery, doing theology through architecture, gives a new edge to this sparkling vision. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and keep an eye out for our next video. Leave a comment and let us know what you think. Jerusalem did not fall into chaos today, but something far more unsettling happened. The ground shook in ways instruments barely caught. Ancient stones shifted, while modern towers stood. A column of light rose over the Temple Mount, and a heavy gray sky pressed down on a city that suddenly felt watched, measured, and warned at the same time. This was not a random earthquake, not just strange weather. It struck prophetic ground with surgical precision, stirred layers of buried history, and collided with a moment when temple preparations, red heifers, and talk of a new altar were already on the edge of reality. Before we go further, like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe, because what we are witnessing is not the end, but the opening warnings. It did not begin with a siren, an alert on a phone, or a red line on a seismic chart. It began with a feeling a low, rising pressure deep beneath Jerusalem, followed by a jolt that seemed to grab the city from below and shake it awake. Witnesses from the old city to the surrounding hills describe the same sequence. First, a heavy stillness, then a thunder-like groan under their feet, and finally, a burst of movement that sent lamps swaying, shelves rattling, and old stone walls flexing, as if they were breathing for the first time in centuries. There was no gradual build-up, no series of smaller tremors to warn anyone. The shaking arrived almost fully formed, violent, focused, and then suddenly gone. Reports did not stay inside Israel. Tremors were felt as far as Turkey, Lebanon, and Syria, reminding everyone that the fault lines running through this land do not respect modern borders and never have. Yet what disturbed many was not just the radius of the shaking, but how the impact seemed to concentrate around Jerusalem itself, striking a city already loaded with history, tension, and prophecy. Residents speak of the shock in two layers. The first shock was physical. Floors shifting, walls creaking, children crying as windows buzzed in their frames. The second came in the silence that followed, a silence so abrupt that it felt intentional, as though a hand had knocked once, hard, and then waited to see who would respond. Scientists, for their part, are cautious. Preliminary readings note an event without the usual foreshocks, without a long chain of escalating activity, and with a pattern of impact that raises more questions than it answers. Officials are quick to calm the public, to use words like manageable and localized, but for those who felt the ground roar beneath them, language like that does not erase the memory of how fast it began and how fast it stopped. In Scripture, earthquakes are rarely just background noise. They are often described as moments when God's voice bypasses debate and human commentary, shaking not only buildings but assumptions. For many in Jerusalem, this event felt less like random seismic stress and more like a sudden, piercing interruption, the kind that forces a city and a watching world to ask, if the ground under the holy city can break its silence this quickly, what else that we thought was stable might be closer to shaking than we realize? As data began to arrive, one detail stood out. This was not a shapeless jolt spread evenly across the land. The lines of impact seemed to trace a path not through the newest districts of Jerusalem, but through its oldest, most theologically loaded ground. Preliminary mapping placed the strongest shaking along a corridor that mirrors the known fault structures around the Mount of Olives. A ridge, already recognized by geologists as vulnerable due to fractured limestone, hidden cavities, and slope instability. In other words, the place long associated with prayer, prophecy, and the footsteps of Jesus is also, in a very real sense, sitting on a system that is ready to move. On the surface, the pattern was hard to ignore. Reports of cracked alleys, shifted tombstones, and warped stone steps surged from the Mount of Olives, the Kidron Valley, and the lanes feeding into the Old City, while many modern neighborhoods with their steel, glass, and fresh foundations emerged with far lighter damage. Engineers pointed to construction standards, soil composition, and the fact that the Old City rests on layers of debris rather than solid bedrock, making it more vulnerable when the ground lurches. Their explanation is not wrong, but for those who walked the streets afterward, it felt incomplete. To many locals, It seemed as if the shaking had chosen the ancient stones, the pilgrimage paths, the historic walls, the places people have prayed and wept over for generations. The word that began to circulate was not random, but selective, as if something had reached into the map of Jerusalem and pressed firmly on the oldest scars first. For believers who know the text of Zechariah 14:4, the imagery was impossible to ignore. The prophecy speaks of a day when the Lord's feet stand on the Mount of Olives and the mountain splits from east to west, forming a great valley language that suddenly feels less abstract when fresh cracks have just traced their way across that same ridge. Scientists, again, speak of coincidence, a seismic event, a vulnerable slope, an unfortunate overlap between geology and history. But for many in Jerusalem, the question will not go away. If this was only coincidence, why did so much of the force fall on the very ground that scripture, memory, and expectation have been circling for thousands of years? Perhaps over time, the people of Israel have come to understand that whether events from their ancestors' time or the events that follow, they all appear to be deliberately coincidental. And, more importantly, not all movement that matters comes with a spike on a chart. In the days after the main shaking, residents began to notice something far slower, stranger, and harder to classify. The city seemed to be shifting in ways that instruments barely registered, but eyes and feet could no longer ignore. Along certain roads near older ridges, asphalt that once lay flat now carried a gentle but visible curve, as if a hidden hand had pushed from beneath. Stone paths that pilgrims had walked for decades no longer met edge to edge. Gaps opened between once tight blocks, and some slabs tilted just enough that water began to pool where it had never collected before. None of this came with the sharp jolt of a new quake. There were no fresh sirens, no urgent updates, only the quiet testimony of misaligned stones and subtle drops in familiar steps. Engineers speak of slow ground deformation, of soft layers undercutting harder ones, of slopes that have been accumulating stress for years and now rearrange themselves millimeter by millimeter. On paper, it can be modeled and explained. In person, it feels like the city is breathing uneasily, like a structure that has begun to lean just enough for everyone inside to sense that something is off, even if nothing has collapsed. What unsettles observers most is not dramatic disaster, but this silent instability. The tremor passes and people expect normal to return, yet the evidence underfoot says the opposite. Alignment is loosening, pressure is still working, and what once felt anchored has begun to drift. It is the difference between a door slammed open and a foundation quietly sinking. One shocks for a moment, the other changes everything over time. For those who read the prophets, this slow, deliberate unsteadiness echoes the language of Isaiah 24:20, where the earth is said to reel like a drunkard, swaying like a fragile hut under the weight of its own guilt. The picture is not of instant annihilation, but of a world losing its balance, staggering before it falls. In Jerusalem, the bending roads and shifting stones have become a living parable of that image, a reminder that sometimes judgment does not shout. It leans, presses, and waits, giving just enough time for people to recognize that their stability was never as solid as they believed. The shaking might have been enough on its own. But what pushed this event from unsettling into deeply disturbing? For many witnesses were the things that appeared when the ground finally went, still not beneath their feet, but above their heads and within the stones themselves. On more than one evening after the quake, people in and around the old city reported a column of pale, concentrated light forming over the Temple Mount. It did not spread like normal glow, did not flicker like lightning. and did not sweep like a search beam. It stood almost vertical, a narrow shaft of radiance hovering above the dome of the rock, before retracting upward and vanishing, as if it had been pulled back into the sky. Security cameras, phones, and live streams captured fragments of the scene, enough to ignite debate. Some called it a lens flare, others a drone effect, others something they simply had no category for. At street level, another layer of disturbance emerged. Residents and visitors alike described a deep, resonant sound rolling through the old city and down into the Kidron Valley. Not quite an explosion, not quite thunder, but a sustained vibration that made walls hum and chests tighten. Some likened it to metallic tones buried under the ground, others to the distant blast of a horn or shofar that never seemed to have a clear point of origin. Whatever it was, it cut through the usual traffic noise and city chatter, forcing people to stop mid-step and look around for something they could not see. Authorities, once again, moved to calm fears. Experts spoke of atmospheric phenomena, reflections from city lights, military exercises, or simple audio illusions amplified by echoing stone corridors. Yet their statements could not erase the testimonies of those who saw the light form in a cloudless patch of sky, or felt a sound pass through the very stones they were leaning on rather than coming from any visible speaker. For people steeped in scripture, it was difficult not to connect these reports with the language of Luke 21:25. There will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars, and on the earth distress of nations. In that framework, the sky is not just a backdrop, and the earth not just inert rock. Both can become instruments, signaling that something larger is in motion. To many in Jerusalem, the combination of a vertical light above the Temple Mount and untraceable sounds pulsing through ancient walls felt like exactly that. Not entertainment, not a hoax to be dismissed with a headline, but a warning note struck in creation itself, asking who is really paying attention. For nearly 5 centuries, the eastern gate of Jerusalem has stood sealed stone, packed into stone. Its arches bricked shut under Ottoman orders, facing a cemetery that was meant to turn prophecy into a dead end. It has been, for generations, more symbol than passageway, the gate that does not open, a reminder carved into the eastern wall that some doors in this city are not controlled by city planners or armies alone. That is why recent images and eyewitness reports have struck so many nerves. Visitors walking the eastern wall now point not to the familiar golden facade, but to new hairline fractures creeping across the masonry above and around the Gate of Mercy. Several stones show visible separation, with thin gaps forming where once they fit tightly together, as if the structure is being pulled or pushed from within. These are not gaping ruptures or dramatic collapses. They are the kind of cracks that whisper before anything shouts. Structural analysts warn that centuries of weathering, underground hollows, and ground subsidence on the eastern slope could be undermining the wall's foundations. They point to reports from nearby neighborhoods where the soil has been slowly sinking, arguing that the gate is simply another victim of time and gravity. From that angle, the message is simple. This is erosion, not eschatology. Yet many who have stood beneath those stones, tracing the new lines with their eyes, sense something more than random decay. The timing in the wake of fresh seismic activity and strange sounds along the walls makes the gate feel less like a relic and more like a pressure point. Some locals speak quietly of trumpet-like tones heard along the eastern dyers, side, vibrations that seem to move through the wall itself before fading back into the city's normal noise. For those who know the text of Ezekiel 44:2, every new fissure carries a theological weight. This gate is to remain shut, because the Lord, the God of Israel, has entered through it. Therefore it will remain shut. In that vision, the sealed gate is not a human achievement, but a divine boundary, closed not out of fear, but out of holiness. To imagine such a gate under stress, showing signs of internal strain, is to imagine a world where the line between closed until God moves and God is about to move suddenly feels thinner than it did a generation ago. Engineers can measure angles and calculate load. They should, and their work matters. But to a growing number of watchful eyes, the Eastern Gate now looks like more than tired stone. It looks like a question carved into Jerusalem's wall. If this gate was shut because God once entered by it, what does it mean when the seal itself begins to groan? While the ground has been moving under Jerusalem, another kind of preparation has been quietly accelerating above it. Far from the fault lines, in classrooms, workshops, and training centers, men are learning how to carry out rituals that have not been performed since the Second Temple fell nearly 2,000 years ago. For years, the Temple Institute and related groups have been reconstructing sacred vessels, musical instruments, and garments not as museum pieces, but as functional tools for a future service. The high priest's breastplate has been crafted with 12 stones. The golden menorah stands ready, and priestly garments, tailored to the exact specifications of Torah law, now hang waiting for bodies that have been trained to wear them. This is not theory. There is already a school in Jerusalem dedicated to instructing Kohanim in the details of temple worship, from offerings to incense to the choreography of blessing. Layered on top of this is the controversy and fascination surrounding the red heifers brought from abroad. According to Numbers 19, the ashes of a flawless red heifer are required to restore ritual purity on a national scale, a prerequisite in many minds for full temple sacrifice to resume.